David Parker had lived in his home for nearly 40 years. It wasn't just a house, it was his sanctuary, the place where he had raised his family, celebrated holidays, and watched the seasons change through the same familiar windows. At 78 years old, he lived alone, his children having moved to different states. But he didn't mind. His home was his comfort. It had seen him through good times and bad, and he intended to stay in it for the rest of his life. That's why when the knock on the door came, he didn't think much of it. David shuffled to the entrance, his knees aching with every step. When he opened the door, two men in bright orange work vests stood outside. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a warm, easygoing smile. The other, younger and leaner, carried a clipboard. "Good afternoon, sir," the older man said, tipping his cap. "We're contractors working down the street, and we noticed some serious issues with your roof. Thought we'd come by and let you know." David frowned. "My roof?" "Yes, sir. From what we can see, there are missing shingles and water damage. You might not notice it from inside yet, but if it's left untreated, it could cause major structural problems." David's stomach twisted. The house had never given him trouble before, but it had been a while since he had any inspections. He was on a fixed retirement income, and costly repairs were the last thing he needed. The younger man with the clipboard chimed in. "We can take a quick look for free, just to make sure it's not worse than we think." David hesitated. Something in his gut told him to be cautious, but he wasn't an expert in home repairs. What if they were right? With a reluctant nod, he stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said. The men exchanged a glance before stepping onto the porch. What David didn't know was that the moment he let them in, his nightmare had already begun. David watched from the ground as the two men climbed onto his roof. Their boots thudded above him, sending small clouds of dust drifting from the ceiling. "Wow," the older one, Mike, called down. "It's worse than we thought." David's heart clenched. "How bad?" There was a pause. Then the younger one, Rick, leaned over the edge. "Sir, you've got some serious structural damage. Looks like rot has set in from water seeping through. If this doesn't get fixed soon, you could be looking at tens of thousands in damage." David swallowed hard. Tens of thousands. His mind raced. Could that be true? The house was old, sure, but he had never noticed any leaks. Wouldn't there be stains, drips, something? Mike jumped down from the roof, wiping sweat from his forehead. He pulled a folder from his back pocket and flipped through before handing David a paper. "We're running a special right now for seniors in the area," he said. "If you act today, we can get started for just $25,000 up front. That's way less than the usual price." David blinked at the paper. $25,000? That was more than he had saved in the past 5 years. I need to think about this," he said slowly. Mike and Rick exchanged a glance before Mike nodded sympathetically. "Of course, sir," he said, placing a firm but gentle hand on David's shoulder. "But I gotta warn you, if this doesn't get fixed soon, one bad storm could make things a lot worse. You could be looking at $100,000 in damage, easy." David's stomach sank. His mind replayed the last winter storm, the winds howling, rain battering the windows. What if Mike was right? As if sensing his hesitation, Rick pulled out his phone. "Tell you what, we can get the team out here first thing tomorrow. You don't even have to pay everything at once. We'll work out a plan." David hesitated. Something felt off. But what if he ignored this and his house actually collapsed in a storm? After a long pause, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." Mike grinned, shaking his hand firmly. "You're making the right choice, sir." As David walked inside to grab his checkbook, he had no idea he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. David barely slept that night. He kept tossing and turning, his mind replaying the contractor's words. One bad storm could cost you everything. By morning, he had made up his mind. With a sigh, he pulled out his checkbook and wrote a $5,000 deposit to M&R Roofing and Repairs. As he handed it over to Mike later that morning, the contractor grinned, slapping a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, sir. We'll take care of everything." A crew of 4 workers arrived that afternoon. They set up ladders, carried toolboxes, and started pulling off shingles. They moved fast, too fast. David stood on the lawn watching uneasily as they hammered and cut into his perfectly fine roof. "Finding a lot of damage up here," Rick called down, shaking his head. "You were lucky we caught this in time." David nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. Then Mike walked over, his expression more serious. "David," he said quietly, "we ran into something." David's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Mike sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like a man delivering bad news. "The rot is worse than we thought. We're talking structural issues. If we don't fix this now, you're looking at a total collapse in a few months." David's blood ran cold. "Total collapse?" Mike nodded grimly. "We need to replace the entire roofing support system." David stared at him, his heart pounding. "How much?" Mike hesitated, then exhaled. "Another $30,000. David felt his knees go weak. "30,000? I can't afford that," he said, voice shaking. Mike put a firm hand on his shoulder. "David, listen to me. If this roof caves in, your insurance won't cover it because it's neglect. You'll be looking at a 6-figure repair bill." David blinked rapidly, his mind spinning. He had spent his whole life being careful with money, but could he afford not to fix this? Then Mike pulled out his clipboard. "Tell you what, we can break this up into payments just like before. If you give us another $10,000 today, we'll get the materials and keep working. We'll figure out the rest later." David swallowed hard. 10,000. That was half his savings, but he couldn't risk his house falling apart. His hands trembled as he signed the check. Mike gave him that same reassuring smile. "You won't regret this, sir." As David walked back inside, he tried to ignore the pit in his stomach. He had no idea that this was only the beginning. David sat in his recliner, staring blankly at the ceiling, listening to the constant hammering and drilling above him. The repairs had barely begun, and already he was $15,000 in the hole. He told himself he was making the right choice. After all, what's money compared to losing a home? But something felt off. The workers were never the same people each day. One morning he'd see a crew of 3 men, and the next only one guy half-heartedly hammering at shingles. And Mike, he was always conveniently unavailable when David had questions. Then, just a few days later, another bomb dropped. "Bad news, David." Mike stood at the door, shaking his head. "David, we've run into something really serious." David felt sick. He already knew what was coming. "The foundation is shifting," Mike continued. "Your house is sitting on unstable ground. The weight of the home is putting pressure on the beams under it." David's mouth went dry. "The foundation? But I thought this was just a roof repair." Mike sighed like he was personally disappointed. "I know. And trust me, I wouldn't bring this up if it wasn't urgent." David gripped the armrests of his chair. "How much?" Mike hesitated. Then he wrote down a number on his clipboard and handed it to David. $50,000. David felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's more than I have in the bank." Mike crouched beside him, his voice low and urgent. "David, listen to me. If we stop now, your house might start sinking. You'll be looking at $200,000 in damages, minimum." David's hands shook. He had spent his entire life saving, being careful, avoiding debt. But what choice did he have? His entire life was in this house. Mike sighed. "We'll help you figure it out. We can work out a loan, or maybe you have retirement funds." David hesitated. He did, but he had never touched it before. He stared at the checkbook in his hands. The numbers blurred. His gut screamed at him to stop, but his fears screamed louder. With a trembling hand, he wrote another check. $50,000. The disappearance. 2 weeks later, they were gone. The workers, the equipment, everything vanished overnight. David called Mike's number, disconnected. "Rick?" No answer. Panic surged through him. What was happening? The repairs? Incomplete. His savings? Drained. His retirement? Gone. And then came the final blow. A contractor from a different company stopped by, offering services. David showed him the work that had been done. The man's expression darkened. "This isn't real work," he said. "They just tore up parts of your house and made it look bad so they could keep charging you." David's stomach dropped. He hadn't just been scammed. He had paid $435,000 to have his home destroyed. David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the numbers on his bank statement. $435,000 gone. Every penny he had painstakingly saved over decades had vanished into the hands of crooks. His hands trembled as he ran them through his thinning gray hair. He had worked his whole life to make sure he could live comfortably in retirement, never relying on loans or debt. And now, he had nothing. The realization hit like a brick wall. He had been scammed, and he had fallen for it. Desperate, David called Mike's number again. Disconnected. He tried Rick. Straight to voicemail. His heart pounded as he flipped through the paperwork they had given him. No real company name, no office address, just a P.O. box. A sickening wave of dread washed over him. How could he have been so blind? His doorbell rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. When he opened the door, he saw his daughter, Rebecca, standing there. She had a worried look on her face, holding up a thick envelope of documents. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" she demanded. David's stomach dropped. He had never told her about the payments. He didn't want to worry her. But Rebecca had been helping him manage his finances for years. She must have seen the withdrawals. David opened his mouth to explain, but his voice caught in his throat. How could he tell her? How could he admit that he, a man who had always prided himself on being careful with money, had been completely taken for a fool? Rebecca pushed past him and marched inside, tossing the stack of papers onto the table. "These guys are frauds, Dad," she snapped. "I looked them up. They're not even licensed contractors. There's no company registered under this name. They took your money and ran." David felt like the walls were closing in. The fear, the shame, the helplessness, it all crashed down on him at once. He started, but Rebecca cut him off. "We're going to the police. Now." David sat across from a detective at the local precinct, his hands clutching his coffee cup. "We see this all the time." The officer sighed, flipping through the paperwork. "These scammers target elderly homeowners. They use fear tactics, convince you your home is falling apart, then bleed you dry with fake repairs." David's stomach turned. The detective shook his head. "They move around fast. By the time victims realize what happened, these guys have already shut down their phone numbers and disappeared. Even if we catch them, getting your money back is almost impossible." David gripped the edge of the table. "So, that's it?" The detective exhaled sharply. "Not necessarily. If they've done this to other people, we may be able to track them down." Rebecca leaned forward. "So what do we do?" The detective tapped a few keys on his computer. "First, I'm going to check if there are any similar complaints in other states. If we find a pattern, we can start looking at bank transfers, ATM withdrawals, and fake business licenses." He turned the screen around to show them, and David's heart stopped. There, in black and white, were 6 other reports, identical to his, different names, different cities, but the same scam. Mike and Rick had been doing this for years, and David had just become their latest victim. Rebecca reached for her father's hand. "Dad, we're going to fight this. We're not letting them get away with it." David looked into his daughter's determined eyes, but he had never felt weaker in his entire life. This wasn't just about the money. It was about his dignity, his home, his pride, and now it was all gone. David sat in the courtroom, his hands gripping the armrests of the cold wooden bench. His life savings were gone, but he wasn't here for the money. He was here for justice. Across the room, 2 men in orange prison jumpsuits sat with their attorneys, Mike and Rick, the same men who had stood on his doorstep months ago, smiling and shaking his hand. But now, they weren't smiling anymore. The investigation had moved quickly after David and Rebecca filed their report. FBI agents tracked down Mike and Rick, linking them to multiple home repair scams across 5 states. It turned out David's case wasn't just one of a few victims, he was one of dozens. Bank records revealed the scam had raked in over $3 million. targeting elderly homeowners who lived alone. Some victims had lost everything, others had lost their homes altogether. And David? He had been weeks away from foreclosure before Rebecca stepped in. David watched as the prosecutor laid out everything the scammers had done: the fake company, the disappearing crews, the rushed contracts, the way they used fear to pressure homeowners into handing over money. These men preyed on the most vulnerable, the prosecutor said, his voice sharp and unwavering. They didn't just steal money, they stole security, they stole dignity. Mike shifted in his seat, staring down at his hands. Rick, however, sat stone-faced, as if this was just another business transaction. David clenched his jaw. They didn't care about the people they destroyed. They just cared about the cash. When the jury returned with their decision, David held his breath. Guilty, on all counts. Mike and Rick were sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. They were also ordered to pay restitution, though David knew he would never see most of his money again. But it didn't matter, because today they didn't win. Today justice did. David never got his $435,000 back. The money was long gone, funneled through fake accounts, spent on luxury cars and hidden overseas. But he did get his house back. Thanks to his daughter's persistence, community donations, and legal assistance, he was able to stay in his home. The repairs? They were nowhere near as bad as Mike and Rick had claimed. A real contractor, one Rebecca hired personally, fixed everything for a fraction of the cost. And as David stood on his front porch one evening looking out at the neighborhood he had lived in for decades, he took a deep breath. He had almost lost everything, but he hadn't. Because in the end, the thing those scammers never expected, he fought back.